In 1929, the world watched markets crumble. Fortunes vanished, banks collapsed, and millions lost everything. But in the shadows, a small group of men quietly made more money than ever before. They saw opportunity in chaos. While ordinary families sold their homes and lined up for bread, these few were buying companies, scooping up land, and cornering entire industries for pennies. History calls it the Great Depression. But for a handful of billionaires, it was the greatest transfer of wealth in modern history. Before we break this down, make sure you're subscribed. We explore the hidden side of money and power every week. Now tell me, where are you watching this from, and what time is it right now? Because no matter the place or the hour, what you're about to see proves one thing. The game has always been rigged for those who understand how money truly works. The Great Depression is often remembered through black and white photos of soup kitchens and desperate faces. But behind those images was a different story, one of manipulation, foresight, and timing. Not everyone was blindsided by the crash. Some saw it coming. A few even helped it happen. And when it did, they were ready. Let's begin with Joseph P. Kennedy. Before becoming the father of a future president, Kennedy was a ruthless investor. In the roaring 1920s, he played the stock market like a casino. But unlike most gamblers, Kennedy understood the house always wins, and he wanted to be the house. He noticed the rampant speculation, the borrowed money fueling stock purchases, and the growing bubble. When others believed stocks could only go up, Kennedy sold. He shorted the market. And when the crash came, his wealth exploded. Kennedy's fortune was built not by luck, but by timing. He moved out before the collapse and bought back in when everything was cheap. When Wall Street burned, he was shopping for bargains. That single move gave him enough money to buy influence, and later, power in Washington. He wasn't alone. Across the Atlantic, the Rothschild family maneuvered through chaos as they had for over a century. Their wealth was diversified, spread across currencies, metals, and nations. While banks fell like dominoes, their capital stayed mobile. They knew how to play both sides, lending to governments, funding recovery, and profiting no matter who lost. Then there was Jesse Livermore, known as the Boy Plunger. He was one of the few traders who made a fortune betting against the market in 1929. He studied human behavior, not just numbers. He knew greed always turns to panic. When stocks reached absurd levels, he took massive short positions. As panic hit, his net worth soared to over $100 million, equivalent to billions today. The public called him a villain, but Livermore said something that still defines modern markets. The game never changes, only the players. And he was right. Every crisis creates winners and losers. Most people are taught to fear crashes. But those who control capital, liquidity, and information know crashes are moments of consolidation. When assets fall, control rises. Let's talk about the Rockefellers. By the 1930s, their oil empire was already massive. But during the Depression, they expanded even more. While thousands of businesses closed, Standard Oil and its subsidiaries were buying them out. Cheap labor, lower prices, and government contracts helped them tighten their grip. Even during chaos, the family's wealth remained largely intact. They had built an empire, resilient enough to thrive on both growth and decline. This wasn't by accident. The Rockefellers invested in industries people couldn't live without: fuel, utilities, and banking. When demand fell, they survived through diversification. When recovery came, they controlled more than before. The lesson was clear: own the foundations of society, and you'll never go hungry. While the public suffered, the Morgans worked behind closed doors. J.P. Morgan and Co. had deep ties to the Federal Reserve, which itself was a relatively new institution created in 1913. During the Depression, Morgan's influence reached into every major financial rescue. They helped merge failing banks, bought distressed assets, and positioned themselves as indispensable. In public, they were stabilizers. In practice, they became gatekeepers. When the banking system broke, Morgan stepped in. But every bailout strengthened their control. By the mid-1930s, J.P. Morgan had restructured finance itself. Fewer players, bigger banks, and tighter regulation that favored institutions already at the top. The Depression didn't destroy them. It secured their dominance for decades. Here's what makes this fascinating. While people think of the Great Depression as a failure of capitalism, it was also a reorganization. The market wiped out the reckless, and power consolidated into fewer hands. Crises are never random. They're filters. Those with cash, knowledge, and connections always emerge stronger. Think of Andrew Mellon, Secretary of the Treasury under President Hoover. Mellon was one of the richest men in America. He advocated for liquidating the economy, letting bad debts die, wages fall, and prices drop. His belief? That it would purge the rottenness from the system. But as millions lost jobs and homes, Mellon's companies survived. They had liquidity. They could wait. And when the dust settled, they bought everything cheap. History calls this the paradox of crisis. When value disappears, power concentrates. The same pattern appeared globally. In Europe, banking dynasties shifted assets abroad. In Asia, trade monopolies tightened control over shipping and finance. In every region, those closest to money creation, central banks, financiers, and industrialists, expanded their reach. Here's the part few people realize. The Federal Reserve, created only 16 years earlier, played a crucial role. In the 1920s, it flooded markets with easy credit. When speculation peaked, it raised rates sharply. The result? Liquidity vanished overnight. The crash wasn't an accident, it was a policy shock. Some historians argue it was engineered to reset the system. The timing, the coordination, the beneficiaries, all point to a designed contraction. The public paid the price. Unemployment hit 25%. Thousands of banks failed. Yet the biggest players survived. Those who had connections to Washington or international markets moved their assets before the collapse. Everyone else was trapped. Sound familiar? That's because this pattern repeats. 1929, 28. Even today, the same structure, just new technology. Crashes transfer wealth from the uninformed to the prepared. They reset who holds assets and who owes debt. The Great Depression taught one brutal truth. Markets don't reward fairness, they reward understanding. When Roosevelt came to power in 1933, he promised a new deal. But that deal didn't punish the old elites, it reorganized them. The government pumped money into infrastructure and industry, much of it through contracts controlled by established families and firms. Reform came, yes, but the hierarchy remained. For example, when Roosevelt confiscated gold in 1933, ordinary citizens had to turn theirs in at $20.67 per ounce. Months later, the government revalued it to $35. Who benefited? Those who moved gold overseas before the law, primarily wealthy bankers and industrialists. Ordinary savers lost 69% of their gold's purchasing power overnight. Crises often hide behind moral language. Restoring stability, protecting the public. But if you trace the flow of capital, you'll find it moves upward, always. By 1934, the system was restructured, not for equality, but for control. The Federal Reserve gained new authority. Gold ownership was banned for citizens, but remained legal for foreign governments and banks. The average person could no longer hold real money. Their savings were confined to paper. And that paper was managed by the very institutions that caused the crisis. This wasn't reform. It was consolidation. Look closely at who emerged strongest from the wreckage. The same names appear over and over. Rockefeller, Morgan, Mellon, DuPont. They weren't wiped out by the collapse. They expanded through it. They bought distressed companies, funded new industries, and positioned themselves as saviors of the economy. But their rescues were never charity. Every loan came with leverage. Every bailout came with ownership. In 1932, when millions of Americans couldn't afford food, Standard Oil was buying refineries. General Motors was expanding production lines. The financial elite didn't wait for recovery. They created it on their terms. Cheap labor, low competition, high dependency. Crises don't just destroy wealth, they reshape the rules of who gets to rebuild it. Take the story of Bernard Baruch. He advised presidents, speculated in markets, and timed exits with precision. Before the crash, Baruch sold stocks quietly while the crowd kept buying. When the crash hit, he shifted into government bonds and gold-linked assets. His fortune grew as others vanished. Later, he became one of Roosevelt's closest advisors, shaping post-crisis policy. In public, he was a patriot. In practice, he was a master of positioning, one of the few who always moved before the crowd. This is how financial power works, not by predicting the future, but by preparing for inevitability. Crises aren't surprises. They're outcomes of systems stretched too far. The insiders never panic. They wait. They have cash. They have access. And they know history. Consider the DuPont family. They started in gunpowder, then chemicals. When war came, they profited. When peace came, they diversified. During the Depression, while others hoarded cash, DuPont acquired companies in textiles, plastics, and automotive parts. They saw what the world would need next, not what it wanted now. By 1940, their empire was larger than ever. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans were trapped. Farmers lost land, homeowners defaulted, small banks collapsed under withdrawals. For every failure, there was a buyer, someone with capital ready to step in. This is the hidden engine of every downturn. Assets don't vanish, they change hands. And those hands are rarely new. The same story unfolded in real estate. Across the country, foreclosures spiked. Property values fell by 50% or more. For the wealthy, it was a once-in-a-lifetime sale. They bought downtown buildings, farmland, and factories for cents on the dollar. When recovery came, the appreciation alone multiplied their wealth. Even in media, consolidation grew. Struggling newspapers were bought by powerful interests who shaped public perception. Narratives of recovery and trust were broadcast while policy quietly shifted toward corporate security. The result? A public convinced of reform and a private elite setting the terms. The Great Depression created the illusion of loss for everyone, but in truth, it separated those who held assets from those who owed liabilities. The wealthy owned, The working class borrowed. When the system reset, owners gained and debtors drowned. You might ask, how did they know when to act? The answer lies in proximity. Those closest to decision-making hear the music stop before anyone else. In 1929, insider warnings spread quietly among major banks weeks before the crash. Rumors of tightening credit and margin calls circulated in private meetings. By the time the public realized, exits were blocked. This same pattern repeats across every major collapse. 1929, 1987, 2008. The insiders don't predict, they prepare. They stay liquid, wait for panic, then deploy capital strategically. It's not gambling, it's architecture. During the Depression, new government programs like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation were marketed as public rescues. But look deeper. The RFC issued billions in loans, much of it to major railroads, banks, and manufacturers. Ordinary citizens saw little. The goal wasn't redistribution, it was stabilization, keeping large players alive to rebuild under new terms. And those terms favored consolidation. Banking laws tightened, smaller institutions merged or died. Large banks absorbed deposits and influence. By the late 1930s, fewer banks held more power than ever before. The crisis didn't decentralize wealth, it concentrated it. Even the gold confiscation law of 1933 served this purpose. Citizens surrendered their metal. The government revalued it higher. That difference, a silent 69% wealth transfer, strengthened public balance sheets and funded the New Deal. Who managed the process? The same banks that had failed the public years earlier. The illusion of reform masked a deeper continuity of power. Let's pause here. Think about the pattern. Every major collapse removes weak hands and strengthens the strong. It destroys trust among the many and rebuilds faith in the few. When people lose confidence in markets, they turn to whoever offers stability, even if it is the same group that caused the instability. The billionaires of the Depression weren't lucky. They were structured. Their wealth wasn't tied to hype or hope. It was rooted in control of production, credit, and policy. Consider Henry Ford. He slowed production during the Depression, but refused to shut down entirely. He paid workers less, but kept them employed. Why? Because he understood the value of loyalty and scale. When recovery began, Ford was ready to capture demand. His competitors had disappeared. The Depression trimmed his costs and erased his rivals. Ford's wealth didn't come from speculation. It came from patience. The same virtue every major billionaire of that era shared. They could wait while others panicked. They could buy when others sold. Even in agriculture, the story was similar. Massive agribusinesses bought bankrupt farms. Mechanization reduced labor needs. By the end of the decade, fewer families owned land, but corporations controlled more acreage than ever. The Depression didn't end ownership. It redefined it. Meanwhile, Wall Street survivors reinvented themselves. Investment banks shifted to underwriting government bonds. Commercial banks merged into giants. Insurance firms expanded. The same class that caused the collapse became the architects of recovery. This wasn't coincidence, it was design. By the late 1930s, the United States had transformed from a nation of small savers into one dominated by institutional power. The little guy no longer held wealth directly. Savings were placed into banks. Banks placed them into government bonds. The government spent that money to rebuild industry. Industry owned by the same wealthy interests that survived the crash. What appeared as recovery was in fact a rotation of control. This is how the Depression quietly minted a new class of billionaires. The names stayed familiar: Rockefeller, Morgan, DuPont, but their reach expanded. Oil, finance, chemicals, and manufacturing were now fused into a single loop. Each sector fed the other. Each crisis reinforced the system. Wealth was no longer about land or labor, it was about credit. Whoever controlled credit controlled everything. Let's trace this through one example: John D. Rockefeller Jr. His father built the oil empire. He built the trust network. During the Depression, while asset prices collapsed, Rockefeller charities and holding companies moved cash strategically. They funded public works, donated to universities, and invested in infrastructure. Every gift created dependency. Cities indebted to Rockefeller's philanthropy later favored his projects. By 1940, Rockefeller Center stood as a monument, not only to wealth, but to influence disguised as generosity. The Mellon family followed a similar path. Andrew Mellon, once Treasury Secretary, faced accusations of causing the Depression through tax and banking policies. But his fortune grew. He diversified early into aluminum, banking, and art. During the downturn, he used private cash to buy assets from failing competitors. When public anger rose, he pivoted into culture, museums, foundations, scholarships, all bearing his name. Reputation laundered through charity, while control remained intact. This model became the template for modern billionaires. Philanthropy isn't loss, it's leverage. It buys access, goodwill, and tax relief. In the 1930s, this was a revelation. Today, it's standard practice. The lesson of the Great Depression wasn't "don't speculate." It was own something real. The wealthy shifted from trading stocks to holding companies, patents, and resources. They didn't bet on prices, they bought systems. The rest of the population learned the opposite: to work, to save, and to trust paper promises. That divide has never closed. Government intervention accelerated the split. Roosevelt's New Deal programs created millions of jobs, but those jobs built assets owned by private capital. Dams, roads, and power plants needed suppliers. Steel from Carnegie, oil from Standard, machinery from GE. Public spending flowed through private channels. The economy recovered, but ownership didn't democratize. By 1939, the United States was preparing for another war. And again, those who held production power were positioned to profit. Depression-era consolidation meant fewer, larger firms could fulfill massive government contracts quickly. World War II became the final act of the financial reset, converting Depression-era debt into wartime growth. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Great Depression didn't destroy capitalism. It refined it. It weeded out small players, rewired regulation, and created a model where crisis leads to concentration. Every major economic shock since has followed the same pattern. Look at 2008. The same logic applied. Smaller banks collapsed. Large ones merged. Governments bailed out the system. Asset prices plunged, then soared. The result? More wealth concentrated in fewer hands. The mechanism hasn't changed since the 1930s. Only the scale has. Now step back and consider the psychology. In times of collapse, fear dominates. People crave stability. Billionaires don't sell stability, they become it. During the Depression, families trusted Rockefeller gas stations, Morgan banks, Ford cars. These weren't brands, they were lifelines. Trust became currency, and the rich understood that better than anyone. Even policy served their interests. The Securities Act of 1933 and the Banking Act of 1933, Glass-Steagall, promised reform, but enforcement depended on insiders. Wall Street adjusted instantly, creating new instruments to navigate the rules. The same firms that sold worthless securities in 1929 became regulated institutions by 1935, with government guarantees backing their deposits. The message was clear. Once you're big enough to threaten the system protects you. That's why the billionaires of the Depression weren't villains in the traditional sense. They were survivors of a game they helped design. The rules weren't fair, but they were consistent. Those who understood leverage, timing, and credit always won. By the time recovery arrived, inequality was embedded. The top 1% controlled more wealth than before the crash. But the narrative shifted. Instead of robber barons, the public saw builders of modern America. They sponsored art, funded universities, and employed millions. The same families who once drew outrage now drew admiration. That transformation wasn't organic, it was strategic. The Great Depression became a myth of loss and redemption. In reality, it was a restructuring. Old fortunes were tested but not broken. New fortunes were created from chaos. Every destroyed asset became an acquisition. Every failed bank became a merger. By the 1940s, America entered its golden age, not because the Depression ended, but because it redefined ownership. The people rebuilt the country. The billionaires owned what they rebuilt. This is the hidden blueprint of wealth through crisis. Stay liquid while others are leveraged. Buy assets when fear peaks. Influence policy to protect scale. Rebrand power as service. That's what the billionaires of the Great Depression mastered. As the economy rebounded and war production accelerated, the foundations laid during the Depression revealed their true power. The billionaires who had survived the crash now controlled industries that were indispensable to the war effort: steel, oil, banking, automobiles, and chemicals. The Roosevelt administration depended on these networks. Contracts flowed to those already entrenched, not because of favoritism, but because they were the only ones left standing. Rockefeller's Standard Oil supplied fuel for the Allied forces. DuPont produced gunpowder and synthetic materials. General Motors built tanks and engines. The Depression had trimmed away competition. The war handed the survivors the ultimate reward: government-backed expansion. Their wealth multiplied again, but this time under the flag of patriotism. This period cemented a truth still visible today. Crises centralize power. In normal times, markets distribute wealth. In emergencies, they concentrate it. When systems strain, society defers to those with capital and capability. The Depression created the myth of indispensable billionaires, those who could save the nation by investing when others couldn't fight tea. That myth still shields power from scrutiny. After the war, these fortunes reshaped the world order. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 established the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency. American financial elites now influence not only domestic recovery, but international trade and credit. Wall Street bankers advised governments, financed reconstruction, and set terms for post-war debt. The same class that thrived in Depression now managed prosperity. Their reach extended beyond business. They funded think tanks, universities, and policy foundations. These institutions trained future leaders and economists who internalized the logic of capital first. By guiding education, they shaped how society understood value, progress, and fairness. This is how power endures. Not by hoarding money, but by defining the ideas around it. You might think the cycle ended there, but it didn't. Every modern downturn repeats the structure of the 1930s. In 1973, during the oil shock, energy companies gained. In 2008, financial giants consolidated. In 2020, technology platforms expanded while small businesses vanished. The scale changes, but the outcome remains constant. The billionaires of the Great Depression taught the modern elite how to use crisis as catalyst. They proved that liquidity during panic equals dominance after recovery. They showed that narrative control, philanthropy, media, education matters as much as balance sheets. And they demonstrated that reform, if guided by insiders, can reinforce the hierarchy rather than dismantle it. For ordinary people, the lesson is uncomfortable. Every collapse you endure transfers ownership upward. Every bailout you applaud preserves existing structures. The wealth gap is not an accident. It is the result of predictable responses to systemic stress. But awareness changes the equation. When you recognize how capital behaves under pressure, you can see through the illusion of fairness. You stop mistaking recovery for equality. You start questioning who benefits when systems reset. So next time you hear about a market crash, a currency crisis, or a global recession, remember the blueprint of the Great Depression. The billionaires didn't flee, they advanced. They didn't panic, they planned. The tragedy wasn't that millions suffered. The tragedy was that those who caused the suffering were rewarded for surviving it. History records the Great Depression as a time of loss. In truth, it was a handoff, and from many hands to a few. And the echoes are still here. Every crisis since has followed that same rhythm: destruction, consolidation, control. If this shifted how you see economic history, tell me in the comments. From which country are you watching, and what time is it there? Because no matter where you are, the lessons of that era shape your present. The Great Depression was not the end of an age. It was the beginning of a system that still defines who wins when the world breaks. And that is the story of the billionaires who profited from the Great Depression.